Picture this: a brand new airline launches with the boldest promise in aviation to make flying guilt-free. The world's first all-electric carrier, led by a celebrity eco-warrior claiming they'd reinvent aviation itself. But wait, if electric planes barely exist, how were they planning to pull this off? Could Ecojet really crack the code when giants like Airbus and Boeing haven't? Or was the green revolution hiding a dirty little secret from the very beginning? Was this the dawn of sustainable aviation, or a paradox that doomed the airline before it even left the ground? Here's what really happened. Ecojet's launch in July 2023 wasn't just an announcement, it was a declaration of a new era. The vision was as cinematic as it was ambitious: to create the world's first all-electric airline and become the flag carrier for Green Britain. Spearheaded by the famous green energy tycoon Dale Vince, a man who built an empire challenging the fossil fuel industry, this was no ordinary startup. Vince was a proven disruptor. He turned a small football club into the world's greenest, created a national network for electric car chargers, and even started a company that makes diamonds from thin air. He was an eco-warrior who knew how to make green profitable. He was joined by Brent Smith, an experienced airline pilot who saw the future of aviation not in bigger, faster jets, but in cleaner ones. Together, they promised to reinvent flying. Theirs was a holistic vision. The planes would be powered by hydrogen electric engines, producing only water as an emission. On board, passengers would eat plant-based meals, all single-use plastics would be banned, and even the staff uniforms would be environmentally friendly. The tagline said it all: same altitude, new attitude. This was more than a business, it was a movement. The initial plan was to connect UK cities, starting with a route from Edinburgh to Southampton, offering what Vince called guilt-free flying. It was a perfect story for a world desperate to solve the climate crisis. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. The world's first all-electric airline had a secret. It wasn't going to be electric at all. The thing nobody tells you about starting an airline is that it's a slow, brutal, and incredibly expensive process. Getting an air operator's certificate from the government, securing precious landing slots at busy airports, these things take years and millions of dollars before you can sell a single ticket. The Ecojet team knew this, so they came up with what they called a pragmatic two-phase plan. Phase 1: launch the airline in early 2024 using conventional 19-seat and 70-seat planes that burned traditional kerosene-based jet fuel. Think about that for a second. The flag carrier for Green Britain, the company promising guilt-free flying, was going to start its life as just another fossil-fueled regional airline. Phase 2, they promised, would be the green revolution. A year later, in 2025, they would begin retrofitting these planes with the futuristic hydrogen electric engines developed by their partner, ZeroAvia. Dale Vince admitted he wasn't happy about it, but called it a necessary step to keep up the momentum. But here's the kicker: this pragmatic choice created a fatal contradiction at the very heart of the company. A startup's most powerful asset is its story. Ecojet's story was about being radically different. By starting with kerosene, they diluted their brand from day one. They were no longer a revolutionary electric airline. They were a standard regional airline that hoped to one day become electric. This seemingly small compromise likely created an investment death trap. Traditional airline investors would see a high-risk startup entering a brutal market, saddled with the extra cost of a future engine swap. But the climate tech and impact investors, the ones most excited by the green vision, would see a company planning to burn fossil fuels. By trying to be practical, Ecojet may have alienated everyone. Their attempt to build momentum may have been the very thing that brought it to a grinding halt. Ecojet's entire future, every promise they made, rested on one single, fragile pillar: a partnership with an Anglo-American tech company called ZeroAvia. Ecojet wasn't building the green engines themselves. They were going to be ZeroAvia's first and biggest customer. They signed deals for up to 70 of the smaller ZA600 engines and over 20 of the larger ZA2000 engines. These powertrains are revolutionary. They use hydrogen in fuel cells to generate electricity, which powers electric motors to spin the propellers. The only emission is clean water. This technology was and is real. ZeroAvia had a prototype flying, a Dornier 228 test plane making successful flights from its UK base. They were targeting certification for their first engine in 2025. But what many overlooked is the brutal reality of aviation certification. It is a slow, unforgiving, and wildly unpredictable process overseen by regulators whose only mission is to guarantee absolute safety. Certifying a brand new type of propulsion system involving highly flammable hydrogen and high-voltage electricity is one of the hardest things you can do in modern engineering. Any delay, any setback, any new regulatory question for Zero Avia would mean a direct and catastrophic delay for Ecojet. This made Ecojet's business model a house of cards. They weren't just an airline, they were a speculative bet on someone else's high-stakes R&D project. For an investor, this is a nightmare. Why fund the airline, which has all the market risk and operational headaches, when you could just invest directly in the core technology provider? Ecojet created a structure with a fatal single point of failure, and it created a timeline that venture capital hates. The airline needed £20 million to survive its first couple of years, but it couldn't promise any revenue until after Zero Avia's engines were certified. Years down the line, it was a cash-burning machine with a path to profit that was completely out of its own control. A brilliant vision can't pay the bills. The £20 million Ecojet needed to raise wasn't for expansion, it was the bare minimum required by the UK's Civil Aviation Authority just to get a license to fly. It was the money they needed to even begin their fossil-fueled first phase. In late 2024, they hired financial advisors and started the hunt for capital. The money never came. A spokesperson blamed a tough investment market, but the strategic flaws were impossible to ignore. By the summer of 2024, the financial reality became brutally clear. The company's official filings showed they had burned through Dale Vince's initial £1 million and were now over £382,000 in debt. The dream of a 2024 launch was long gone. The date was pushed to 2025, then to a speculative 2026. With the company bleeding cash, they had to take drastic action. In January 2025, 11 of the company's 13 employees were let go. The operational teams, the regulatory experts, the people needed to actually build an airline were all gone. The staff was reduced to a skeleton crew of just 2. The offices near Edinburgh Airport were a ghost town. Recruitment for pilots and cabin crew was frozen. The entire operation ground to a halt. What many overlooked in the company's filings was a small but telling detail. The company was officially a going concern, meaning it had the resources to stay in business. But how? The documents revealed the truth. Its survival was entirely dependent on Dale Vince continuing to personally fund its losses. Ecojet had ceased to be a viable independent company. It was now a zombie startup on life support, propped up by its founder's deep pockets. For any outside investor, this was the ultimate red flag. The revolution was officially grounded, not by a technological failure, but by a simple lack of cash. But what if the official story, a tough market and a flawed strategy, isn't the whole story? When a revolution this promising dies this quickly, whispers are bound to start. In the darkest corners of aviation forums and industry backchannels, wilder theories have taken root. Many people are crazy about these ideas, but they raise unsettling questions. The first, and most obvious, is sabotage. You see, a successful Ecojet wasn't just a threat to other airlines, it was a threat to the entire multi-trillion-dollar oil and gas industry. Could shadowy players with vested interests in maintaining the status quo have quietly pressured potential investors to stay away? In a world where energy is power, it's not an impossible thought. Then there's a more cynical theory, one that points the finger directly at its founder. Was Ecojet ever meant to be a real airline? Or was it, to put it mildly, the ultimate publicity stunt? Dale Vince is a master of branding. This venture generated global headlines, cementing his status as a visionary eco-warrior and boosting his Green Britain brand. The airline's failure doesn't tarnish that image. It reinforces the narrative that he's a bold disruptor taking on impossible challenges. Maybe the goal was never to get off the ground, but simply to make a point. The most shocking theory, however, is also the simplest. The core technology is much further away than anyone is willing to admit. The thing nobody tells tells you is that hydrogen electric flight faces monumental physics problems related to energy density and storage. What if the promising test flights are just that, tests, and the path to a commercially viable certified engine is still decades away? Perhaps Ecojet's collapse wasn't a failure, but an early, quiet warning that the entire green aviation dream is still just a dream. While these theories swirl, the grounded reality points to a much simpler and perhaps more brutal truth. Even if the technology had been ready and even if the £20 million had appeared, Ecojet was flying straight into the deadliest airspace in the aviation industry, the UK regional market. This market is a graveyard for airlines. It's defined by razor-thin profit margins, crushing fixed costs, and ferocious competition. The high-profile collapse of Flybe, not once, but twice, is a perfect example of how unforgiving this market is, even for a huge established player. Into this meat grinder came Ecojet, a tiny startup with a plan to price match the giants. They weren't going to charge a premium for their green flights. This was a recipe for financial disaster. They would be forced to compete on price against airlines with massive economies of scale, all while carrying the huge future cost of converting their entire fleet to a new, unproven technology. But here's the final crucial piece of the puzzle. Ecojet's strategy was uniquely risky compared to other green aviation startups. Companies building flying taxis like Joby and Archer are creating a brand new market for city-to-city hops, avoiding direct competition. Others, like Sweden's Heart Aerospace, are using a more cautious hybrid electric approach to reduce risk. And ZeroAvia, their own partner, was smart enough to stick to what it did best, developing the technology, not running an airline. Ecojet, on the other hand, took on every single risk at once. They took on the technological risk of ZeroAvia, the regulatory risk of certification, the financial risk of being undercapitalized, and the market risk of entering a notoriously difficult industry. It was a strategy of maximum exposure. So, while the vision was inspiring, the business plan was, to put it mildly, deeply flawed. The story of Ecojet's collapse isn't really about the failure of green aviation. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of a brilliant vision built on an unstable foundation, a lesson that in the world of aviation, ambition and reality are often on a collision course. Click here to check out our other videos.